Good evening, councillors. Welcome to today's meeting. This is a public meeting and members of the public and press are permitted to report on the proceedings. Reporting includes filming, photography, making an audio recording, providing commentary on proceedings. Please note this meeting is recorded live and streamed live. These recordings are published on the relevant meeting page of the council's website. By choosing to attend this public meeting, you are deemed to have given your consent to being filmed or recorded and for any footage to be broadcast or published. If the alarm sounds, the premises must be evacuated immediately. Do not spend time collecting your personal belongings. All emergency escape routes are clearly signed. Once you have left the building, the assembly point is in the High Street, opposite the Guildhall. Members and other speakers are reminded to use their microphone when speaking. Thank you. Welcome to all the new councillors to this meeting. I think it's Councillor Rudge and Councillor Mace. Welcome to the Communities Committee meeting. Thank you. I don't think there's any other new members on this committee. We'll take appointments of substitute, please, Julian.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, we do have just one substitute, and that's Jenny Barnes. She's here for Jill De Sarah this evening.
Thank you. Item number 2, are there any declarations of interest, please? No, none recorded. Thank you. Any public participation?
No, Chair.
Thank you. In which case we'll go on to item number 4, which is the minutes.
I have a Ukrainian refugee in the house that I've been housing for over 2 years, so I know that it is on the agenda for housing generally, so I'm just raising it. It's not going to make any difference to any voting intentions, but for transparency.
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. That's good. Okay, agenda item number 4, minutes then. You can go through them. Page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4. Councillor Lawrenson.
Thank you, Chair. So, yes, I was contacted by a resident about the meeting in March, and it was about Homes for Ukraine. I understand that the minutes can't be changed for accuracy, but we can use this meeting as an opportunity to put forward correct information according to the resident. And let me read the comment. She wrote, "It was clearly stated at the communities meeting in March that only UK nationals can now become hosts of Ukrainian visitors, which is incorrect. The report also said that you had to be British and have settled status. This should have read British or have settled status. I understand that the minutes that we're looking at now can't be corrected, but at least I've had the opportunity to put it on the YouTube recording. The resident was very, very keen that I say what I've just said on her behalf. So that's regarding the Homes for Ukraine item on pages 4/5. Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. So that's not obviously recorded in here, but it's noted.
Yeah, it's following advice that I've had from an officer.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Lawrenson. Page number 5. Page 6. And finally, page 7. Okay, they're agreed. Agenda item number 5, then, Q4 and annual performance reports, 23-24. Shane?
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, councillors. This is the final performance scorecard for 23-24. It's pleasing to note that all of the projects and actions are in the green category, except for the top one, community engagement strategy, but that is due, I understand, for presentation here in July, so it's slightly behind, but should be along its way shortly. In terms of the KPIs, it's slightly more mixed picture, but there are detailed explanations against each of those in the text, so I'm not proposing to go through those, but if there are any questions or further clarifications required, then there are people more qualified than me to answer those, so I'm happy to end there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I open it up to the floor then, please? Is there any? Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Chair. It's on page 28, which is little 18, the HMO licence applications inspected, which seems comparatively low. How much of that is due to landlords being resistant to the inspections? And if they're resistant, what penalties are put in to make sure they do comply?
Thank you, Councillor Barnes. Tom?
Yeah, so the delays are generally around the return of information, particularly where there's quite a lot of information that's required to process the licence application. So I wouldn't necessarily describe it as landlords being resistant. It's just the time it takes for information to come through and to be verified. But we don't undertake the inspection until we've got all of the relevant information needed to process the application. Ultimately, where landlords don't comply, the ultimate escalation can lead to prosecution if someone's operating a HMO which is unlicensed. But we generally don't have to result in that. We're able to resolve it prior to reaching that stage.
Thank you. Got Councillor Mace and then Councillor Lawrence.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I've got like 5 questions, but I just wanted to start off with saying I'm really pleased to see in the scorecard the reduction of families in B&Bs for 6 weeks to 0 in the final quarter of the year, and the average time down to 15 days, because these are people who are going through the most troubling time, and it's caused extreme anxiety. So I'm very pleased to see the minimising of that and the work that's gone into that. And I'm also really pleased to see the growth in active participation at the leisure centres. I think that's a really, really good success story that we will see the benefits for many years. So hopefully I'll take the questions one at a time rather than trying to load up 5 at once that you have to come back on. So first one is on the PSPO. That's a completed project to review those. Has all the signage been taken down for the city centre PSPO? Is that one has now expired?
I think it's been brought to our attention, Chair, that there is still some signage out there relating to the PSPO, so we've put resource on that, and hopefully we'll conclude that in the next couple of weeks, if not before. But we are aware that there was still some historical signage out there.
Okay, thank you. On the minimum energy efficiency standard enforcement project, what kind of housing was that working on? Is it private housing, social housing, both?
The MEES regulations only apply to private rented accommodation.
Okay, thank you. On the percentage of people owed a main housing duty, which I know is recommended for removal, my reading of the text for that was that although the percentage has gone up, the absolute number of people owed a main housing duty has gone down because they were dealt with earlier in the system. I just wanted to check that understanding is correct.
Yeah, so it is a slightly confusing performance indicator, hence the rationale for removing it from the scorecard in the next year. Essentially, it's a reflection of the total number of homeless applications which have resulted in a housing outcome, of which were undertaken when it had reached a main housing duty. So it means basically that we haven't been able to either prevent or relieve that household or that applicant's homelessness. So we have had some positive impacts around prevention and relief, but we are still seeing some of the legacy impacts around being unable to do that, and therefore people reaching a main duty status essentially. So it's not a positive necessarily that the percentage has gone up, but it doesn't give the full picture because it's not reflective necessarily of that quarter, and is somewhat of a legacy issue that that we're seeing an improved trajectory of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. On the percentage of HMO licence applications, so can or indeed do landlords operate HMOs while the application process is ongoing? And the reason I ask that question is because my concern would be essentially how long can landlords operate an HMO before they get a licence by slow walking, providing information?
Yes, so they can operate. So we take the licence application from the date that the application's submitted. So subject to it being approved, we backdate the licence from the date that it was applied for. So they can operate whilst the application process, the licence application is being processed. We do set quite rigid timescales around the processing of those, so we don't allow that to just drift and drift. And ultimately, if a landlord doesn't comply with those timescales, we'll not grant the licence. The implications of that would mean that the landlord would have to reapply for a licence, which comes at an additional cost. So when the licence application's made, they pay for the licence up front. So there are a lot of disincentives around delaying that, and we do set quite clear timescales throughout the process to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thank you. And last question was number of households assisted into private rented accommodation, which is on page 24. I think the performance indicator says the annual target was missed, but all the quarter targets were exceeded. So I was wondering if there's a mistake in that one.
Yeah, sorry, just trying to find it in the report pack, but essentially, yeah, the figure that was quoted as the annual value, I think it's just an error. That reflects the Q4 value. So it is just an error, and you're right that it did exceed. There we are, yeah. So the value of the annual value is just the value of the Q4. The total value is the combination of the Q1 to Q4 figures. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And thank you for everyone's patience.
Thank you, Councillor Mace. Councillor Lawrence and then Councillor Amos.
Thank you, Chair. Going back, unfortunately, to those HMOs again. Is there a metric for them being reapplied for? You know, standards are being maintained and that they're sticking to the number of people in the properties. And I too would also like to add my heartfelt thanks to you and your team for getting those people out of B&Bs. I know when you started that was the situation, and it was I was new to communities, and it was very sad to hear that we had that five houses of people, I think it was, 5 families stuck in B&B, and I was so pleased to see that figure of 0. And I know it was something you wanted to do, and so thank you for achieving that.
Thank you. Credit to Rosie and the team for achieving that. So in terms of the HMO licence applications, in terms of reapplications.
So how often are they reapply for or checks done on them, and is there a metric for seeing how well they're sticking to their regulations, repeating conversation, you know, their paperwork?
Yeah, so the licence needs to be applied for every 5 years. And there isn't a process for re-inspection during the course of a licence. What we do is where there's a report from a resident within a HMO, we'll then go out and inspect, but that will be sort of using alternative legislation, so around property standards. So if there's concerns that are raised, we'll go out and address that as we would with other properties. Otherwise, the licence continues to run. What we do is impose additional licence conditions on occasions, so where additional works are required, we'll factor those into the licence conditions when it's granted, and then we do re-inspect to ensure that they've been complied with.
I see. So quite a few of these licences are kind of reapplications for an existing. That's why they're allowed to operate, because they already do exist.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Amos?
Yes, thank you. There are two points, if I may. First of all, on page 23, percentage of ASB inquiries resolved within 1 month. Could I just ask, does this include neighbour nuisance? Because my experience of neighbour nuisance complaints is that they are difficult very often to resolve, and they certainly take more than 1 month to resolve. But if I read the figures correctly, it says we've got a 100% success rate, which of course would be wonderful if that's as I understand it. So could we have just a bit of clarification on that, Chair?
Yeah, I think the complaints referred to in this statistic, Chair, are those complaints that wouldn't be dealt with by Worcester Regulatory Services. So noise nuisance isn't in there, Councillor Amos. I think what is in there is the sort of stuff that Warwick and Anne Nichols and that team deal with. So it's the, I know it's not low level to those who are suffering it, but it's what we would class as the lower level ASB, not the noise nuisance, not the statutory nuisance, but more sort of neighbour to neighbour disputes and those types of things.
Just to clarify, Chair, so it's did you say neighbour nuisance, or the word you used?
Yeah, I'm presuming it's generally neighbour to neighbour nuisance. But what I'm saying is it wouldn't be the sort of things that Worcestershire Regulatory Services deal with. So it wouldn't be noise, it wouldn't be smoke, it wouldn't be smell, it wouldn't be those types of nuisance complaint. It would be sort of general antisocial behaviour, but not statutory nuisance.
Thank you, Chair. That answers that one. And my second question is page 34, number of households assisted into private rented accommodation. I'm just wondering whether we could, in future reports at some stage, perhaps collect a bit more information if it were possible to do so, because the narrative talks about the private rented sector in terms of availability and affordability. But I think there's one other aspect that has bothered me, and I think it may bother other members from time to time, is about the landlords themselves. Obviously, we would be very particular into which accommodation we put people, but in the private sector generally, I suspect there's a very high proportion of people who are, for various reasons, vulnerable, and I would be concerned if there are rogue landlords, and I think there are, and when I say rogue, I mean probably criminal. Do we have any information about whether people are being properly and legally evicted? In other words, there's a process to go through, they can't be summarily thrown out, because that's the sort of thing that would concern me to do with private rented accommodation. It may be bigger than this statistic here, but do we have that information? Would it be helpful to have that in future?
Yeah, I think part of the question you may be referring to, Councillor Amos, is about how many how many Section 25 notices were served as a result of the City Council intervening and asking landlords to follow due process. I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so we do. I suppose there's two things. So there's where notices have been served by landlords, which may not have been done correctly in line with legislation. So we'll review whether they've been followed correctly, whether they've been issued correctly, followed due process. So whether they're legally binding, and we'll provide advice to tenants in those circumstances. That doesn't necessarily mean they're rogue landlords or what have you, but it may be they're trying to circumnavigate the system or just don't understand the process that they need to follow. Where there's been illegal evictions, so where somebody's been forced out without following due process, then we do have means to intervene in those circumstances. We do try and intervene before that happens, so if there's an indication that could be happening, or a landlord's putting pressure on an individual. But the legislative process that we're able to follow can only happen once an illegal eviction's been undertaken, and we do have means to progress those. Thankfully, they're relatively few in nature, but we do have processes and we are able to act. There are conditions that apply. The tenant has to be willing to engage with us to pursue a prosecution in those circumstances, which obviously, if somebody is vulnerable, can be a challenge, but we obviously provide support to enable that to happen wherever possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Barnes?
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to ask about Airbnb, because it's a growing sector of the housing market, and although it's going to be under more legislation shortly, the long-term lets, short and medium-term are still out there without really very much control. Have you noticed any particular issues with Airbnb, and what, if anything, are we doing to keep an eye on that market?
We did a piece of work, it's been last year, around Airbnbs. The government consulted on a proposed change of legislation which would have seen greater regulation around short-term lets. So we did do some analysis around the impact of Airbnb type accommodation short-term lets within Worcester. And essentially our findings were that there was nothing significant, wasn't causing any significant impact on the local housing market, or that we were aware that there's any particular issues around the quality or delivery of that type of accommodation. So we haven't revisited that. We don't have any sort of necessarily any regulatory role as a local authority to oversee that type of accommodation. But there was, as I said, there was a government consultation around it. We haven't seen anything come forward from that yet, or what the results of the consultation have led to at this stage. But it has been on the sort of agenda, and we have looked at it previously, but didn't raise any specific concerns in Worcester, at least.
Do we have any further questions? Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of points. Under the number of affordable housing completions, as we know, there is a shortage of affordable housing both locally and nationally. And I've always felt we weren't really ambitious enough as a council when it comes to affordable housing. And I mean, it's good to see that obviously the target now is double what it was, you know, sort of 2 or 3 years ago, but it has plateaued at 200 houses. And I was just going to ask, you know, who sets this target? When is this target reviewed? And is there some scope to be more ambitious and to increase this target? Although, you know, just increasing the target doesn't mean anything unless you're actually going to take positive action to meet it. And I sometimes wonder whether we as a council make full use of the various kind of levers that we have as a council in order to encourage more building of affordable housing. I realise, you know, the detail does talk about how some of the housing is built just outside the boundaries of the city, and so effectively it is part of the greater Worcester, if you want to put it on those lines. But I still think we should be a bit more ambitious as a council to increase the amount of affordable housing. My second sort of point is about free tennis, which I asked a question in full council about 2 or 3 years ago about this, and I'm still a big fan of free tennis, partly because Cripplegate Park obviously used to be in my old ward, but also because, you know, free tennis is good for young people and it's good for the general health and well-being of the population. And again, you know, I'm not quite convinced we've got this right, actually, to be honest with you. The amount of take-up of free tennis, I think, still remains relatively low. And again, I wonder about the accessibility of this. I know Freedom Leisure gives, with the cooperation of the council, free tennis at certain times. I'm not sure whether it is always at times which fit in with what people want to do. You know, are we reviewing how accessible it actually is? Because there's no point in having free tennis at X time in the morning when nobody's going to actually use it. So again, when is the opportunity with Freedom Leisure to review the accessibility of the free tennis that we offer?
Thank you, Councillor Lamb. Tom, do you want to take the first one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's trying to get the balance around setting the targets for affordable housing completions is always a bit of a challenge. And whilst we want to be as ambitious as possible, we're trying to make sure that it is realistic, even if that is, I suppose, isn't necessarily at the levels that we would like to see. I mean, obviously we're going to be talking about the homelessness report, which clearly identifies the need for more homes. We're acutely aware of the need to deliver more affordable homes, but there are lots of challenges to enable us to do so. We have made a sort of corporate commitment to increase that. It's a key sort of strategic priority for us. And what I probably would end saying is that we're due to bring a much fuller paper in July's committee to outline some options around how we can seek to improve delivery around this area.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thanks, Chair. I know the issue of free tennis has been sort of bouncing around for some time. But on a serious note, Councillor Lamb is right to point out that as members, you've approved additional investment each year into the operating model of tennis. Now, initially, we tried to widen participation by looking at the hours of free access across the week. That didn't provide the uptake that we would have hoped for. And in the past couple of years, what we've then done is we've opened the courts for free, doing that sort of Wimbledon fortnight, with that sort of burst of interest that comes with Wimbledon. That has been more successful. And we continue to talk to Freedom about various different ways in which we can promote tennis and which we can encourage tennis. My fear is still that tennis is seen as a bit of an elitist sport, and that's a bit of a barrier for people to take part. But that shouldn't put us off. So there are things that Freedom do over and above what I've discussed. I think every opportunity they get when they turn up at events, they promote tennis. They've obviously got they've got tennis coaches in place. They go into schools, so there is activity taking place. But if we need to revisit that conversation with Freedom, then we will do. To answer Councillor Lamb's question directly, if members recall, part of the loan and grant deal with the Lawn Tennis Association for investment into the courts was there had to be a contractor procured to deliver tennis for us, and Freedom with a successful contractor. That contract actually comes to an end next year. So there's a natural conversation brewing anyway around how we deliver tennis and how it's operated.
Yeah, thank you, Lloyd, on that, and obviously we'll take that back in terms of suitability, considering Wimbledon's just around the corner, in terms of that, to see what is the best offer that we can put out there to engage our communities the most. Thank you. If there aren't any other questions on this, I'm just going to quickly sum up. I think overall there's a good set of measures here, particularly around improvement in housing conditions and housing intervention, minimum efficiency standards, slight reduction in rough sleeping, I believe, as well. It's a good set of indicators that actually this committee has been working on. I know from a Labour manifesto pledge a couple of years, we set out particularly to improve housing quality and conditions within this city, and these are small steps that we are going towards in achieving that. And I appreciate all the members around this table being able to hold landlords and hold our officers to account in order to improve those standards out in the city. Thank you. I think it is for noting. Is that correct? Be happy to note it. Thank you. Agenda item 6 then, proposed committee performance scorecard 24-25.
Thank you, Chair. This is the continuation of the discussion which we started with at the end of the last municipal year. And thank you for all the feedback and comments that we got around that. The result is that we've largely carried forward in a similar format to the one we had previously. We've made some changes. Overall, what we've tried to do is retain that duality of projects and activities for the committee, but also the performance indicators. But in the latter case, try to focus more on what is it that the committee is seeking to do, what are its objectives, what are its aims, what are its ambitions for the year, and how do those indicators help us to support progress against those. And then secondly, to perhaps put a bit more focus on the annual ones in terms of providing a report, not necessarily a year-end report, but a report at regular stages during the year on those things which are relevant to the committee, in which those key KPIs are then presented as part of supporting that. So in terms of the key projects and activities, there are a couple of new ones which are coming on to the committee this year. The 3G or weather pitch obviously is a big capital project that's coming up this year, and we have a lot of focus on that, so we'll be interested to see how that progresses. And then the review of the private sector housing strategy will be an important consideration, especially in the light of what we've just been discussing in terms of the desire to drive up standards within that. There are quite a few that are coming up because they've been completed. So that reflects a lot of the work which was done through the committee last year and has now been brought to a successful conclusion. Most of which are reported on in that year-end report that we've just considered. So I think those are all kind of largely self-explanatory. In terms of the KPIs, there's one new one that's proposed, which is down on page 45 there, and that's the number of disabled people living independently through home adaptations. So that was on the health and wellbeing indicator, but it's been removed to here because we think it's a better home for it in terms of its link to affordable housing and other forms of accommodation. And then the ones which are being removed there at the bottom of page 45, they are largely parts of clarification. So some of these we've just been discussing, for instance, the number of households assisted with private rented accommodation. That doesn't reflect the performance so much as just the availability of accommodation, and the percentage of people owed the main housing duty is being removed because, again, it's not providing any performance invitation. What is important is prevention and relief PI, so those ones that have been retained. The number of families in temporary accommodation at quarter end, we had two previously, which was households and families, so there's really just a duplication. And as we've been seeing, we've made a lot of progress on that, so we'll just focus on the households one, which will incorporate families as well. And then finally, the number of Worcester Community Grants awarded, well, we've got a new approach to that for this year, which was worked through the Policy and Resources Committee. So the allocations for 24-25 have already been made, so there's no further reporting to be done. We'll do that again when we come to next year. Okay, so we've tried to rationalise them a bit, focus them a bit more on what are the activities of the committee, and try to say, well, where it's an annual one, let's just do that as a part of a report, merely than simply reporting the best statistics, and try and get it as part of, you know, a driving agenda for what we're trying to achieve. Okay, that's the proposal. Just in reflection on what Councillor Lamb was just saying, targets, of course, are proposed. So if members feel that they want to review those or have a look at them or question them, then of course, we're open to do that here or at future meetings of the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Shane. I'll open it up to the floor. Are there any questions or comments on this report, please? Councillor Mace.
Yeah, it was just on the one of the targets the new ones proposed, the number of disabled people living independently through home adaptations, with a previous target of 400 and a target for next year of 400. Obviously, we have an agenda item later which is going to look at the suspension of the discretionary top-ups for such people. So I'm wondering if that target has been set in account of that change, to see whether that's going to be an achievable target.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, the delivery last year in total was 449. So elsewhere we have provided last year's delivery as a target where there's been no other rationale for setting a target this year. So we've got some comparable data to use. So it is a small reduction on this year's delivery. Although the recommendation around the discretionary top-up grants is being proposed, which obviously we'll come to later on the agenda, we don't anticipate that to have significant numbers of people. So the quantity should still remain sort of similar kind of level.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. The quarterly KPIs, I noticed that the number of properties improved through private sector. You've increased the target from 50 to 100 because we've hit 91. So that makes sense that we didn't have a target. We're doing quite well with that. But then I noticed that the number of households on the waiting list, you're taking from 3,500 to 4,000 because we've already got in excess of the target on the waiting list. I know we've all got, as we've already said, we've got housing issues and stuff like that, but is this the right way to go? We're just moving our target higher. You know, I'd like to see that number coming down rather than, and not artificially, because they've found homes rather than they've not qualified for or moved on somewhere else. So I don't know if there's any is there anything we can do to improve that target, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's a target we'd like to see going down and to see delivery or the numbers reducing. I think the reality is that housing need is increasing. We're having more people apply for housing. Not everybody with an acute housing need, so around 50% of applicants on the housing register don't have any recognised housing need in line with our allocations policy. So they're not necessarily lots of people in acute need. It could be somebody that's perfectly suitably housed but just wants to move. So a proportion of those people will be those. The challenge is moving people on into accommodation, and a lot of that is around the availability of suitable options. So we could set a lower target. I think the reality will be is that we anticipate numbers to continue to grow. I mean, we do reviews of the housing register to try and make sure that people are still, living in the current accommodation, still have a housing need, still wish to continue to apply, so that it is reflective of the number of people that are actually have a form of housing need or wish to move. But we'd like to see that number come down, but it's probably not going to happen through people moving into accommodation. It's more likely would happen if we made a different policy decision around that, the way we allocate properties, how we assess need, if we remove people from the housing register as opposed to them all moving into accommodation.
Thank you. Councillor Rudge.
Thanks, Chair. As a newcomer to this committee and not familiar with some of the jargon, I'm trying to get my head around the issue of affordable housing completions. The target rationale, can you just explain to me what's meant by support project, housing enabling strategy and delivery plan? Are we saying that there is one and that's going to help us reach the target of 200? Or we'd like to have one, or there is one which explains why we only got 105? I don't know what that means exactly.
Through you, Chair, just in terms, John, of the process. So what we were trying to do was to try and demonstrate how the KPIs support the activity. So we've got a housing enabling strategy and delivery plan. The project for this year for the committee will be the delivery of that, to see how well it goes and how much progress we make in terms of delivering that plan. And therefore, that indicator is supporting us, supporting the committee to see how far we're going in respect of that. So that's all it means by support project. That's the project that's being supported by that indicator. But there is a housing enabling strategy and delivery plan, and that should drive us towards achieving the targets that we want to achieve.
Councillor Rudge.
Thank you, I'm halfway there. Does that mean we're doing something new this year that we didn't do last year? Or we're doing more of the same and crossing our fingers that we're going to have more houses, that we're going to get closer to that target?
Yeah, so the council has I refer to it. We have a housing enabling strategy and a delivery plan. And I think that covers a 3 or a 5 year period. So in that plan, it will say year 1 actions, year 2 actions, and year 3 actions. I think we're now into year 2. So, Councillor Rudge, if you were to, when you have time, take a look at that document, that sets out what we as a council, the approaches we're taking, and the things that we're going to try and do to increase the delivery of social housing. And then, as Shane said, what we've got is a KPI attached to that, where we will then annually report to you the number of social homes completed.
Thank you. Councillor Collier.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the target for the number of young people engaged with in response to referrals, referring to antisocial behaviour, hotspot reactive work. So we're aiming for a target that is lower than the number worked with this year, and rationale being a reduction in resources. It's partly a comment, I guess, partly a question in there as well. Has the implication of aiming to targeting fewer young people, have the implications of that been considered? Has that been discussed with youth work partners, for example? Because it's then interesting to think about another KPI being, percentage of antisocial behaviour inquiries being successfully resolved. How those two targets could link. My question or comment really is, has the implications of that, lowering that target of young people working with, been sort of, how's that been considered?
Thank you, Councillor Beer.
Yeah, I mean, we're well aware that it will have an impact. I mean, this does reflect the delivery from the council perspective. We do work with a range of other organisations. I think, Sue, is it called the what's the name? Youth Collaborative, is it? I think it's Youth Collaborative, where other services provide outreach and youth work and things. So it has been a topic of conversation there around how we can engage and support that. Beyond 20 March next year, the funding for our youth outreach service will, completely end. So that will have an even greater impact. So obviously over the course of this coming year, we're sort of preparing and planning for and mitigating the impact of that across the city.
Thank you. I've got one question in terms of the number of sports and play and activities participants. I've noticed that the target has actually decreased. The anomaly seems to be, or the irony seems to be doing that we're investing more in leisure facilities, especially obviously the 3G pitch up at Purdyswell and other play areas in and around the city. Why are we reducing it? What's going wrong there? Are those figures taken from Freedom Leisure, or are they a sum total of all the activities that happen through private and public sector?
Chair, I can only presume that we've, and I should refer back to the previous report, but I can only presume that we've based the 24-25 target on the 23-24 actual. That might be the reason for the change, but again, that's me assuming. So we can clarify that point and come back to you in writing if that's okay with you. Okay. But the point's understood. Yeah.
Thank you. If there aren't any further comments, can we all agree on the recommendation that the content of the scorecard is noted? Agreed. Thank you all. That's carried. Thank you. We have agenda item 7, which is the annual homelessness and rough sleeper update. Rosie.
It's me. Okay, so I'll try and keep this brief. It's very long appendices. I appreciate lots of information in there. But essentially, the annual report is giving an overview of the role that we as a local housing authority play in housing and homelessness in the city and meeting housing need. There are lots of different strands of homelessness, obviously rough sleeping being the most visible, but there's also a lot of hidden homelessness in the city and nationwide that we also work to resolve. There's a range of legislation which we work to in assisting households who are threatened with homelessness, and our priority in all cases is to aim to prevent homelessness wherever possible, so prevent the upheaval and the expense of people becoming homeless and needing to move to a new home. So we have a county-wide homelessness and rough sleeper strategy, but a specific Worcester City action plan in order to meet the aims of that strategy, recognising the fact that Worcester City has different needs to that of other neighbouring districts. And we also have a number of county-wide and district-level groups and forums which oversee various actions within that strategy and action plan. So moving on to section 3, the demand on the service has been relatively consistent with previous years, and again consistency with the main reasons for people becoming homeless being family and friend evictions, ending of private sector tenancies and domestic abuse. We've also had an ending rough sleeping plan running for the last year and have just refreshed that for 24-25, which sets out how we will reduce rough sleeping and to commit to rough sleeping and homelessness in the city being rare, brief and non-recurring. We receive funding from the government through various different funding streams, some of which is county-wide, some of which is district-specific, and we commission a number of services in order to assist us to meet the needs of various different cohorts. So just looking at some headlines then, rather than, as I said, going through everything, some of the real successes that we've had this year has been around, as been mentioned already, reduction in number of households in temporary accommodation overall, and significant reduction the number of families spending significant period of time in temporary accommodation. Also, we've had a lot of success with our rough sleeper pathways, so a lot of the funding that we've had in Worcester City has meant that we've really been able to strengthen the partnerships we have with other statutory services, but also the voluntary and community sector. And we've had some real successes on individual cases by working really, really well as a partnership for those individuals with the most complex needs. We've also had a lot of success in terms of prevention pathways, so a number of different new forums and pathways working with prisons, with hospitals, with mental health, with housing providers, with supported housing providers, to try to capture people at the absolute earliest intervention we can to try to prevent that homelessness wherever possible. And as part of a restructure within the team, we looked at reallocating staff resource to move that resource to that front end early intervention prevention, as opposed to dealing with the resultant homelessness. And the last part of the report then covers the proposed allocation of resources for the coming year. So, as I said, we receive funding via a number of funding streams. The Homelessness Prevention Grant, which we receive from government, which is ring-fenced for preventing homelessness. And we also receive specific funding around rough sleepers, the Rough Sleeper Initiative. We also receive funding for the Rough Sleeper Drug and Alcohol Treatment Grant, and also a specific mental health rough sleeper project in the city. And the report emphasises the point that actually the vast majority of this funding is only committed thus far until April 2025. So there is quite a bit of uncertainty around the future of that funding, and we have plans in place to work as a county to identify what's worked really well over the last 3 years, what we think we need to continue going forward, and where we want to prioritise our resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. I've got Councillor Lawrence. Councillor Lawrenson.
Thank you, Chair. We already visited this on Monday, as Councillor Brios will know. This concern about the challenge of losing the grant, that we don't know that we've definitely got this funding continued, and it's very essential. You're doing very good work with it. I am concerned, and I expect everybody else is. Will we be revisiting this later in the year when we have a new government, or do we need to take a marker now that we ask that new government to guarantee this funding or better scheme, because this is essential work?
Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a topic of conversation with our advisors from DLUC for several months now. We have quarterly meetings with both the rough sleeper and homelessness advisors, and so we've been feeding it through to them. They're acutely aware of the reliance on homelessness grants, not just for us around our direct delivery and our sort of statutory responsibilities, but also for third parties, and obviously not having assurance around continuation of funding does place lots of projects at risk. Obviously staff, have uncertainty around, the future employment status, etc. So we are doing what we're able to do to try and highlight that message. And what we're currently doing is to do an evaluation of services within Worcester, but also across the county, so that we're in a strong position once we know what the funding arrangements post 2025 will look like, that we know we're really clear about what it is we need and want, and we've got the evidence base to support that. Previously, homelessness grant schemes often have very short timescales to submit bids and to prepare needs assessments and things. So we're trying to get ahead of the game, so we're in the best possible position to maximise what we get from it. We anticipate there will be continuation funding. The impact of not having funding would be immense across, Worcester, but across the country. So to turn off the tap and to cut all funding would, I can't see that happening. But obviously, we just don't have any certainty around what that will look like beyond March next year.
I think given that it's a predictable, ongoing situation, to be expecting councils and officers to wait to find out whether or not anything is going to be delivered into our gift bag when it's actual taxpayers' money and is needed to support people who are in need in our local community. It doesn't help anybody to see people not in solid accommodation, because it affects their health, it affects their education of their children, and it affects their general well-being. That impacts on all of us, and it can increase crime. If people are in uncertainties, they might turn to crime because they haven't got regular income. This situation doesn't help anybody, and I think we need to go back, once there is a new government, I think we need to go back and make sure this funding is going to be guaranteed and on a regular and continuous basis.
Here. Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. We hear you loud and clear. Councillor Lawrenson.
Thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Lawrence has articulated it perfectly, asked the question that I wanted to ask and made the comments that I would have made. I would only add to what she's already said, that there's an impact, the uncertainty has an impact on staff as well as the people that we're there to support. We've got a domestic abuse housing officer. I'm looking at page 4 of the update. So many skilled staff there who are presumably looking anxiously into the future. What's going to happen next? Domestic abuse housing officer, a placement officer, and so on and so on. You can see it for yourself. So I do hope that we can make this a priority as Worcester City Council, that as soon as the general election's done and dusted, that we go to whichever party's leading the country and say, can you secure this homelessness prevention funding for the staff and for the people that it's meant to support? It's just because April 2025 is going to soon come round, and it takes time for these grants to kick in. So thank you very much, Councillor Lawrence.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lawrence, and hopefully each of us can make it loud and clear to each of our parliamentary candidates. So whoever makes it into the Houses of Parliament, to knock on that door for us. I've got Councillor Wilmore and then Councillor Mace.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Rosie, and to your team for all that you've done. I think we know as councillors, when we're contacted by people who are at imminent risk of homelessness, how upsetting and distressing it is, and your team are at the real sharp end of that. So I hope that, between you and your team, you're at a real risk of moral injury, so I hope you do take time for your own well-being as well. I'm really saddened, but not shocked, to see the level of domestic abuse need for this kind of accommodation. I've got sort of 2 questions really. One is, you can't measure what you don't know, but from your sense on the ground, is there a real unmet need there for people who are fleeing domestically violent situations? And then my other question is, there's no mention in the causes of homelessness, young adults coming out of the care system. I know there is another category, and I'm just wondering, do they fall within that other category, or again, is there a cohort of young people who are coming out the care system who we know are at high risk of homelessness who aren't captured in this data? So again, I'm just about the unmet need that we know is out there, but maybe haven't been able to objectively measure.
Yeah, so in terms of domestic abuse, I think, so the Domestic Abuse Act, which was enacted a couple of years ago, has imposed a number of different duties and responsibilities on local authorities and other public bodies. So I think that has certainly helped to reveal and prioritise that cohort. In terms of the need for accommodation, so we identified previously that we needed an additional 10 safe houses in Worcester City to accommodate domestic abuse survivors with that specialist support, and that's something that we are proactively working on. However, we haven't found that in the interim, because we've been able to make the positive changes we have to temporary accommodation, that has been an unmet need, and we have been able to deliver that specialist support in appropriate accommodation. In terms of young people leaving care, yeah, absolutely, that is a category of causes of homelessness, and for those young people, you know, that cliff edge at 18 looks very large, but we have a protocol working arrangement with Children's Services so that we are aware of those young people at least 6 months before they are 18. We meet regularly to identify what their needs might be, what suitable accommodation would be for them. Not all young people will be ready for that independent accommodation. We might be looking at extending their placements with Children's Services or supported accommodation. I would just say that in looking at the numbers, that will be a relatively small proportion of the reason for homelessness in Worcester City, at least. But it is a huge issue, obviously, for the young people themselves.
Thank you. And just a follow-up, if I may. With the domestic abuse survivors, I know that there is often a need for them to be placed in safe houses away from Worcester. When does our duty of care to them end, or once they've been transferred to another authority, is that authority then responsible for making sure that their housing is safe and adequate and all the rest of it?
Yeah, so it very much depends really on how that process is done. In some cases, what we find is that people will flee from an area, come to Worcester and just approach us direct. We may find that we place people in refuge accommodation out of area, but we retain that homelessness duty and responsibility and duty of care, or we may do a formal referral to another local authority, making the case that they aren't safe to remain in Worcester and they therefore need to flee to their area. And in that case, at the point that that local authority accepts that duty, they would pick up that duty of care. But there's no time in any of those where there would be a gap in that responsibility.
Thank you. Just want to follow up on one of those questions that Councillor Wilmore raised regarding young people leaving the care system. Is there a priority that they get over and above our statutory duty? And if you can explain that for me, please.
Yep, so young people leaving care are an automatic category of what's called priority need in homeless legislation. So they will automatically qualify for full homelessness assistance. And then there are also additional protections around young people leaving care, in that if they do leave care without a solution having been identified and they need temporary accommodation, we are unable to place them in bed and breakfast accommodation, for example, so we have to find more suitable accommodation. And they also have additional support from personal advisors with Children's Services. So there are additional protections and additional support provision for those young people, yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. Councillor Mace.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the report. I think it's very difficult to call any report dealing with homelessness and rough sleeping positive, but I think it's a really good report, and there are lots of positives to be taken from it, particularly with a budget so tight, to see that we are bucking the trend for the national news stories of people in B&Bs and cost of temporary accommodation. And I think hopefully whenever you're looking at best practices across the county, that is something that can be replicated across the county, because I think it is a really good positive and the right thing to do budgetarily for Worcester. I wanted to agree with Councillor Lawrence. Definitely, the government needs to provide certainty for this funding. It's absolutely unacceptable that we can be less than a year away of the funding ending and not knowing if it's going to continue at this point. So hopefully we can get certainty around that as soon as possible. I did have 3 questions. So in the report on page 57 in the report pack, it states that, the table shows that the reflecting the ages of people needing homelessness, and I think the commentary in the report says that 16 to 17-year-olds presenting as homeless rose sharply, but in the table we can see that actually it's the rates last year were fairly consistent with the rates between 2019 and 2022. So I was wondering what happened in 2022-23 that took it down so low.
Yeah, we've actually picked up this as an error of data on the report. So actually the figure for 22-23 for 16 17-year-olds was 46. So it's broadly in comparison. I mean, the past 2 years have been a drop, but nothing particularly notable.
Okay.
So we need to update that on the report.
Thank you. Regarding the lack of 4 plus bedroom homes, where there's a need for that, is there anything that can be done via planning policy to require those to be included in new developments where social housing is being provided? And could the City Council does it ever look at purchasing such homes itself?
Yeah, so planning policy does cover the meeting housing need. So it's generally done on a site-by-site basis. So each site will be considered, and the sort of makeup of that site will be based. So the property types, the tenure of the properties, property makeup, size of properties, if there's any sort of specifically adapted properties, etc., are all considered as part of that application. So it is subject to negotiation, and viability considerations do come into that. Around if there's 3 4-bed houses, it may not be viable, and instead of 10 2-bed houses. So there is a balance to be met, but it is recognised within our planning policy documents around housing need and the need for larger family accommodation. So that is already recognised and considered.
Okay. And last one, so one of the obviously big causes of risks of becoming homeless is no-fault evictions, which I know the government has stated multiple times it was going to end, but isn't going to do it before the general election. So I was just wondering if ending those would significantly reduce the risk of ending homelessness, or becoming homeless, sorry.
We would like to think so and hope so. I think we just don't know is probably the honest answer. There will still be grounds for possession, so the Section 8 will remain, so that there has to be a reason for serving notice, whereas with Section 21s there doesn't need to be a reason given. So we would anticipate there to be less opportunity for landlords to pursue possession. But that said, the Section 8 is a quicker route to possession, so if landlords do wish to pursue that, they have evidence to pursue possession. We could see homelessness be sped up somewhat. What we probably would anticipate is in the lead up to the legislation becoming sort of enacted or becoming live, that landlords may choose to serve Section 21 notices whilst they can. So we might see a spike in notices being issued in advance of which, sometimes with those types of changes to legislation, you do see a reaction because there'll be a change and they'll be prohibited from doing so. But certainly during COVID, where there was a sort of hiatus on being able to serve Section 21, that changed the picture dramatically. So we saw a massive drop in, notice was being issued with Section 21 notice. So the presentations coming to us weren't for as a result of that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. You've got Councillor Lawrence and then Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a bit of curiosity about the, I go on page 57, there's a table with the relative age ranges, and I noticed that the one bracket was significantly higher to the others, but I have also noticed it's a wider bracket than the others. But is there any particular reason why the 30 to 40-year-olds is this big step up, or is it just because it's a wider age demograph? Is it, that's it, is it?
Yeah, I think there is an element of that. I think, but actually, it's also that particular part of the population, that working age population, or those who may be in receipt of just basic benefits, maybe don't have young children, don't meet the additional priority categories that particularly young or particularly old people would have. So yeah, I think it is that particular age group that probably would have fewer options for housing.
Thank you. Councillor Lunn.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was also going to come back to this table on page 57 because it is really, really interesting actually. And there is a theory, isn't there, that homelessness was driven to a certain extent by COVID and by lockdown. You know, it's the old adage that hell is other people, isn't it? And when people are forced together with no chance of escape, as people were during lockdown, that's one of the things that builds tensions within relationships, within families. And you would expect perhaps, and there is evidence that there was a bit of an increase between 2021 and 21-22, which would fit in with COVID. But then you would hope that that sort of, if that is a trend, that would then sort of diminish afterwards as COVID faded away. But there seems to be, the trend has continued upwards. There seems to be more and more approaches. And therefore, I'm wondering whether you've got any kind of ideas about, you know, why this broader trend is happening, why there seems to be an increasing number of approaches, an increasing number of homelessness, which then has a knock-on impact on the challenges on resources that have been highlighted elsewhere in the meeting. So if this is going to continue upwards, then clearly resources are going to become ever more stretched, and therefore there's going to be increasing demands on what we have. So I wonder whether there's anything that you found out which sort of explains this upward trend.
So yeah, I think during the pandemic, you know, as Tom just said, the profile of reasons for homelessness and the profile of those approaching as homeless did change because there was a moratorium on evictions. But then you, as you've alluded to, you may find that actually there's more people being evicted by friends and family because of that, you know, close quarters, domestic abuse, and so on. But in some ways, it actually masked the problem during the pandemic, and also because there was a moratorium on evictions, there was also a significant reduction in the number of social housing properties which were available for letting. So far fewer people were being housed, there were more and more people in temporary accommodation. And then when the moratorium was lifted, there was then quite a big spike in approaches and spike in evictions being the cause of that. In addition to that, then since then, obviously, we've had cost of living crisis, we've had the war in Ukraine, which has meant that we've had additional approaches from that cohort of people. We've also had an, additional refugee population, which has also increased the numbers. Plus the private rented sector nationally, and particularly in Worcester City, is increasingly unaffordable and inaccessible for the people who are in that very low income bracket. So there are fewer solutions and fewer options for people when they do enter housing need.
Thank you. Are there any other speakers on this item? Councillor Barnes, I'll take you as the last speaker.
After such a serious subject, a moment of levity. Page 47, 1.2. I don't believe we are a rough city.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Barnes. I don't believe we're a rough city either, but maybe referring to the rough plan. Okay, I mean, thank you, members. That was really engaging debate and really good points being made there. I think the key points is obviously acknowledging great work the team are doing in terms of that reduction in temporary accommodation, actually, and the accommodation that we are now seeking is of a higher and better quality than we have sought before as well, which is a reflection of the improvement in housing standards that our homeless people are going. The key message to take off here obviously is the uncertainty around the funding, and that message has to get through to DLUHC and central government, whoever is in power post July the 4th. So can I take the recommendations on block then, 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3? All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you, Julian. Item number 8, recommissioning of the Worcestershire Promoting Independent Living Service.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try and avoid as many acronyms here as possible. And I'm conscious it might be something that hasn't been in front of this committee for some time, possibly not even since the last request to commission the current service. So just to provide a little bit of background initially, so we have a home improvement agency, so that's the sort of official title of it. Within Worcestershire, we refer to that as the Promoting Independent Living Service, or PIL service. So that's in recognition of what it does. Essentially, it is around promoting independent living and enabling people to remain in their own homes. It's commissioned across each of the 6 district councils and the county council. So we all combine to achieve essentially an efficiency through having a much larger contract, and it provides a range of services. Primary one surrounds the disabled facilities grants, but also a range of other discretionary funding streams, grants as well. So the aim is to maintain and restore the use of the home for residents, so that they can retain their independence and carry on living in the community. As this applies not just for older people, it is for all ages and all demographics within the community. It's been delivered by Millbrook Healthcare since April of 2020, following a procurement exercise. The current contract is due to end in March next year. Current service, last year's delivery led to 126 mandatory disabled facilities grants being delivered within the city, and a further 43 discretionary grants being delivered. The service is funded through the Better Care Fund. So the Better Care Fund comes from government, goes to county council, but a proportion is ring-fenced for district councils, which they then passport onto us for the specific purpose of delivering disabled facilities grants. So we receive that through county on an annual basis. We fund the service through a sort of a calculation of capital and revenue funding. So it's entirely funded through the Better Care Fund, and the revenue funding, so the cost of actually facilitating the service, is attributed from a proportion of the capital spend. So the amount of work that's delivered then receives a proportion of revenue funding to enable it to be delivered essentially. And then, so we provide the majority of our Better Care Fund allocation through to the PIL contract, so through to Millbrook Healthcare, but we do retain a proportion of that Better Care Fund allocation, which we use for other provision. So we use it for the installation of ceiling track and hoists. We use it for additional provision for the occupational therapy service, to improve the process of assessments being undertaken, as well as retaining some for the administrative costs of managing it and delivering the contract ourselves. So as part of this process, we undertook a review of the current service. So we formed a project group which was made up of representatives from each of the commissioning authorities, as well as sort of wider partners such as the occupational therapists, neighbourhood teams, integrated care board, healthcare trust, to inform how well the service has been delivered currently, but also to inform what we would require within a new specification. We also engaged Services of Foundations, so they're the government-funded body for home improvement agencies, so the sort of national representative organisation, and they've been supporting with the recommissioning process. What we did was to engage them for 2 purposes. One, around the review of the current service, so they helped to facilitate workshops with stakeholders. They did a sort of deep dive of the data from the current service and collated that into a report. They've facilitated a member briefing earlier this year. They've done, as I say, they've done sort of quantitative and qualitative analysis of data, and we've also requested they undertake a process review to look at how we can improve the end-to-end process moving forward. The second stage of the project supported by Foundations has been the recommissioning. So we're reaching the point, I suppose, the end of that now, with this paper coming to committee this evening. So that's been around developing specification, valuation, weighting, and that's all been informed by the first project and the review that's been undertaken. Outlined in 3.7 in the report details what the various service elements are. Broadly speaking, they're pretty much the same as the current contract. So the actual focus of delivery will remain broadly in line with what we currently deliver, both the mandatory element and the wider sort of discretionary funding. And I suppose the findings of the reviews, what we tried to do is to factor in the findings of the service review into the new specification. What was quite clear throughout, through whichever stakeholder we engaged with and looking at the data, was that the biggest issue was surrounded the timescales involved, and particularly around end-to-end, so from the initial inquiry of somebody requiring or needing an adaptation to the completion of the works. That was consistently the biggest area of concern. What we did recognise was that the data that was reviewed did include the full length of the contract up to the point that it was undertaken, and that did include the period of COVID. That did have a significant impact on this service in particular, going into vulnerable people's homes. Obviously, there was limitations around that. Occupational therapists were diverted to alternative provisions. That did see quite a significant impact on this contract for a couple of years. It's since recovered from that, so isn't necessarily indicative of current performance, but nonetheless did highlight a concern around the timescales involved. So there's various stages. So what's difficult to explain clearly is the complexity we're dealing with a DFG and the process that it has to go through. So there's lots of different touch points, lots of different organisations involved, and within the Home Improvement Agency, there's various different stages that it has to follow as well. So case management, technical officer, appraisal, it has to go through planning, has to go through landlord approval, quotations, etc., etc. That does depend on the nature of the work. So a smaller adaptation like a level access shower will be a lot quicker than an extension or something more significant. But we have engaged Foundations to undertake a process review. So what we did identify through the service review was that there were lots of points where it could be a lot more efficient. So where we could be duplicating work at the same time rather than it being in an entirely sort of linear process. So we're going to have, so that's going to feed into the new specification essentially. So we'll have a much more efficient process, end-to-end process, which will improve delivery. We also picked up some other concerns, particularly from residents around communication. So that was primarily around larger works where they take some significant time. So the time from application to actually the adaptation being delivered, particularly if it's a large extension or something like that, can be many, many months. So the communication and updates throughout that time, particularly where it's sitting with planning or something like that, and it's not much seemingly going on. So we picked that up and have strengthened that within the specification, and that will be embedded in the contract as well. And then just how we can better improve and align the service with other services in the county. So it's not operating in isolation. So a lot of work's been done through an advisory group and through working with stakeholders in the development of the specification. So next steps really are subject to approval tonight, is that we would be looking to publish the specification and commence the recommissioning exercise. That's planned to go to be published on the 7th of August. Then it will follow moderation of tender, submissions, evaluation, and then we'll be looking for the contract to start on the 1st of April next year. The timescales set out give sufficient time for sort of demobilisation and remobilisation, particularly if it's going to be, if it were to be a different provider. Conscious that there's, as I say, it's quite a complex area of work, and there would be caseloads and what have you to transfer. So what we're really keen on doing is mitigate any impact on anybody that's currently within the system, and obviously there's staffing implications and things. So that gives us sufficient time to manage that in an effective way. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll open that up to the floor. Are there any questions or comments? Councillor Mason and Councillor Rudge.
I think I've just got one detail question. So that the money that we pay out for the Promoting Independent Living service contract to be delivering these grants across the county, is that the payments that we pay to the Home Improvement Agency ring fence for just Worcester, or can that be spent across the whole county?
Yeah, so each district has a ring-fenced allowance. There's a calculation that government make around what allocation each district will have. So in theory, that's based on need. But yeah, there's a methodology that's applied, and that's ring-fenced to the council. So we can choose how we use and how we allocate that funding, and that's an individual district decision. What we do find is that by commissioning a home improvement agency rather than doing direct delivery, you know, we can achieve much greater efficiencies because it's a much larger contract. Otherwise, there'd be a lot of duplication around the county.
Come back with I just want to get one clarification. I understand the money the government gives to, or calculates that we get from county or via county for it is ring fenced, but then presumably all the district councils are then paying it into the Home Improvement Agency. I just wanted to, the detail I wanted to check was, once it goes back into the Home Improvement Agency, is it then still ring fenced to Worcester?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So whatever we put in is directly delivered in Worcester. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Rudge, and then Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that Millbrook Healthcare is our current provider. Are you saying that you think they're doing a very good job and they're likely to continue, or do you think there's a strong kind of field of other applicants that may do even better? I would be surprised. It seems such a specialised area that there may not be that many other alternative providers.
Yeah, I mean, there are limited home improvement agencies across the country. We know that elsewhere there are other providers which wouldn't typically be referred to as a home improvement agency do run contracts like this. So it could be things like a sort of established large-scale builder that may be able to do the works, so somebody that might otherwise be contracted to actually do the works may wish to bid for the contract. But we've been doing some soft market testing. So Foundations, as I say, are the sort of national body for home improvement agencies. So they've been sort of sharing that we're going through this process with to attract sort of interest and to gauge to gauge interest from providers that operate in this area of work. We've got a market engagement event next week, so that's gone out through the procurement portal. So that's been shared widely. So anyone that's registered on the portal will be notified of that. I think we've got around 8 providers off the top of my head that are due to attend that market engagement event. So So yeah, and obviously it will be based on the submissions that we receive as to who's awarded the contract.
I think the the question Councillor John Rudge was asking was that there isn't any weighting given to an existing provider within the framework. I've got Councillor Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully it's quick. Para 2.5 contains a link to housing assistance policy. When I looked at that, it says that it was approved in November 21 and was due a review in October 22. Is that the link to the current one? And if not, are there plans to review that policy?
Yeah, I'd have to double check that link, but I think that probably is still the current policy. So I don't think it's changed since that policy was adopted. Generally, once the housing assistance policy is around how we're going to deliver our Better Care Fund allocation. So that would have been established at the point of the new contract being delivered. That's how we've been delivering it since then. So it will need to be updated, and it's planned to be updated prior to the new contract next year. So that will be coming back to this committee in due course.
Thank you. It does seem very tight time frame to give yourself on that policy. November 21 to October 22 wasn't very long.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Councillor Barnes.
Thank you, Chair. The council received a total of 848,000 and a bit of BCF grant, of which 802,000 went through PIL. What happened to the rest of it? About 46,000.
Yeah, so it's a combination of things. So in actual fact, some of the spend would have been from reserve, which was an underspend which was carried forward from the previous year. So there was a greater amount which didn't go through directly to the PIL service, but where there's a gap between those figures, that's where ceiling track hoists have been funded, where the additional occupational therapy has been provided, and where we've retained funding for the sort of delivery in-house as well. So it's fairly resource intensive to manage the contract and to assess and to approve grants that come through the service. I think I've detailed that elsewhere within the report. 2.8 in the report.
Well, if I can say, yeah, so we wouldn't class it as peripheries. So the money that we don't provide to Millbrook, some of that we use to cover our own staff costs. So Tom's private sector housing team, they do work on monitoring, assessing, overseeing how the DFG process is delivered. There's the ceiling track hoists support we provide the county council with. So that's an actual piece of work that's delivered within people's homes. And I can't remember the third element, but not everything is covered, not everything is delivered through the Millbrook contract. So there is an element that's delivered outside of that.
Okay, Councillor Lawrence, if I take you as the last speaker on this item.
Just out of curiosity, this equipment that's installed, when it's no longer needed by that household, is it recovered and can it be reused? Can it be donated to other countries? Does it have a reuse of value, or is it just used and then just not needed anymore when it's finally, does it go into, I hope it doesn't go into landfill, but if you see what I mean, can it be reused or reallocated?
Okay, yeah, I mean, you can answer that question. I would have thought that is in the ownership of the resident at that point, and then it's up to them how they dispose of it. Is that right?
Yeah, so it wouldn't automatically be reused, but if somebody were to move or to pass away, and there was the opportunity to reuse or take out a stair lift, for instance, then that would be the ceiling track hoists and tracking certainly is reused. So that does come out. I mean, it does depend on how well used it's been and how long it's been in there and things, and whether that's viable or not. But yeah, it's not yeah, necessary. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I've got a comment which I've received from, and a question from Councillor Robert Norfolk, she was due to speak at this meeting today, but she wasn't able to make it, so I'll read it out, if that's okay. Robin says she has a resident who applied for a DFG. They were measured for a stair lift by the fitting company, followed by a 6-month wait. The stair lift was fitted. The resident tried to use the stair lift and hurt herself on the journey upstairs, and was subsequently advised not to use the stair lift again by occupational therapy. During the 6-month wait, the company asserted that the resident gained weight and changed dimensions, which is why he managed to injure himself. The assertion is that the principle of measure twice, cut once should have been applied. Given the weight and the mobility issues, it should have been recognised that there was every chance my resident might have gained weight. 2 points that she wanted to make was that the scheme really needs to cater for the occasions where there's a gap between the grant application and the application being granted, and it is inevitable that the situations will change over 6 months or so. Which is the point that you were referring to in terms of the whole application process from start to finish and the length of time that it takes and the continuous changing situation of the applicants. And the second point is, what insight do we have over the satisfaction with regards to interventions made with a DFG?
Yeah, on the first point, I think we've pulled out and we recognise that timescales haven't been what we would like to be. I mean, I can provide assurance that they've drastically improved. So it is in a much stronger place than it once was, but nonetheless, they can take time to go through. There are some capacity limitations around the delivery of DFGs, but things have improved. Millbrook will receive the referral from the occupational therapy team. So I mean, I can't comment on that case. I'm not sure, I don't know the detail of it, but if the recommendation was that was a suitable adaptation, that would have ordinarily been undertaken at the occupational therapy stage. Then Millbrook would be installing it based on the recommendations of the occupational therapist. So I don't know. I mean, I can look into I can contact Robin and look into the case in a bit more detail as to what's happened there. But if there's been a significant change in the individual circumstances, because that could happen for any number of reasons, and what we don't want to be doing is installing adaptations which don't meet people's needs, or particularly if those have changed. So point taken, and I think timescales is a key issue around quick and effective intervention to prevent the need for a change or an impact on them.
So the second point was around what insights do we have over the satisfaction on, obviously, back of several members having concerns within their wards with applicants that have gone through the process about the inadequacy of the works or the value for money we're getting out of Millbrook and the work that they're doing in terms of that. Who monitors that, and how do we hold them to account in this process? Can we, as part of this contract, improve that that scrutiny mechanism? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We've picked up on that point. We've built in additional measures for the requirement to undertake satisfaction surveys and for that to be fed through the performance report. So that is an omission from the current contract. We did get feedback through the service review, from residents that had received the service. That's been factored in and taken into consideration in the development of the new spec. But certainly is something that I think we can strengthen moving forward.
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I know you wanted to bring it to a close, but I think as officers we've also reflected that over the last several years this subject has not really been raised particularly much at this committee. So what we now intend to do is to bring an annual report around DFGs and also bring the Home Improvement Agency contractor in as part of that conversation. So if all members are supportive of that, we'll continue on that track.
No, thank you, Lloyd. That's reassuring. So we'll bring that item to the close then. If members are happy to approve the recommendations on block from 1.1 to 1.4, all those in favour? Thank you. That's unanimous, Julian. Thank you. And the final item, hopefully, is the agenda item 9, Disabled Facility Grants, temporary suspension of the discretionary top-up grant. Tom?
Thank you, Chair. Unintentionally, somewhat connected to the previous report, but a different matter nonetheless. So as I've explained, how we receive grant funding through the Better Care Fund, through County Council, that is primarily there to deliver mandatory disabled facilities grants. So that is our statutory responsibility as a local authority to deliver those, and the reason why we receive the Better Care Fund in recognition of the delivery of those. We do, however, provide a range of other discretionary funding grants which are available, and a lot of those are primarily focused on trying to prevent the need for more extensive adaptations to a property, keep people living independently. So hence the reason for having those. Of the discretionary funding is detailed within 2.3 of the report. So there's a range of different options that are provided. I suppose of particular note is the discretionary DFG top-up, which this report relates to. The mandatory limit for DFGs is set by government, and it's been set for many years at £30,000, in recognition that you can't get an extension or a significant conversion to a property for £30,000. We've provided a top-up to that mandatory grant on a discretionary basis. So we're not obliged to do so, but essentially you won't get an extension within the mandatory limit. We set that top-up limit of £25,000 in Worcester. That is higher than elsewhere within the county. I think elsewhere, each of the other districts, I think, is set at £20,000. So we've always been fairly generous in our approach to the allocation of discretionary top-up grants, but also we've had the budget available to enable us to do so. I've outlined what else we do with the funding, that we allocate that to ceiling track hoists. We use a proportion towards discretionary, towards staffing costs. There's further detail in table 1 of the report. So what we have been doing is forecasting. So over the past 12 months, we've seen, as I mentioned previously, a significant increase in uptake of activity by Millbrook. So that's sort of come out of the back of COVID, where delivery was low. So we were 12 months, 18 months ago, our greater concern was we were not spending enough money. That's completely flipped on its head to now essentially we're spending too much money, or it's going out too quickly. It's as a result of a combination of things. So improved efficiencies, so applications are now going through a lot quicker. It's also as a result of us, we injected some funding towards the occupational therapy service, so we were having much quicker assessments, which is then improving access into the Millbrook service, and subsequently more grants are being able to be approved and processed, but also significantly higher costs. So you're probably all aware of rising costs around materials, contractors, everything has just grown exponentially. So that has had an impact on the capital allocations of each individual grant. And we haven't received significantly higher sums in recognition of that through our Better Care Fund allocation. So essentially we've identified that the the amount of funding within the system is in excess of what we have allocated in this year's budget. That's not taking into account anything that will come into the system over the course of the coming 12 months or any sort of wider discretionary spend. So we're in a position where we anticipate there's likely to be, if we were to continue on the current trajectory, a significant overspend of our Better Care Fund allocation. We've been trying to do more work around forecasting demand. It's a very difficult area to do. We don't know the value of each individual claim that's going to come through. Even when an application's made, it's not always that clear how much that grant will be. So although there are some standard approaches, so obviously we know what the cost of a general level access shower will be or a stair lift, but it's not always entirely accurate, and particularly for more complex works, the cost can vary quite significantly, and it does take time for us to get more accurate forecasts around those costs. What we do know is that despite sort of fairly modest estimates, we do anticipate that to be in excess of our budget. We try to look at whether there is what we're seeing is as a result directly of coming out of COVID. So as I said, there was a big delay in applications. We're conscious this could just be a catch-up of applications now processing through as efficiencies have been realised, but the feedback from the occupational therapy service is that the number of cases that they're seeing remains, it's not massively going up, but it remains relatively high still, so they haven't seen a drop off. So we anticipate that will continue, the demand will continue essentially, and that's, I suppose, reflective of the ageing population in the city and across the county. So we've taken steps essentially to mitigate the risk to the authority of overspending. So the implications to the council of doing so, we still have a statutory responsibility to deliver the mandatory grants. So we would have to look potentially at funding those ourselves, drawing down from reserves, etc., rather than being able to solely rely on the Better Care Fund allocation. So to mitigate that, we've paused the allocation of discretionary DFG top-ups for new applications coming into the system. So there are around 17 applications that have already been made for discretionary top-ups, which were already at various points within the system. We've set up a panel to review each of those applications so that we can determine whether they meet the criteria, whether we're able to approve those, but those will still be considered because they're some way within the system and have set expectations that they've been accepted as referrals. I can't guarantee that each of those will be undertaken, but we'll apply the same sort of process and methodology as we have done previously to determine whether or not we're able to support those top-up, the discretionary top-up grants on those applications. So there is support available. So implementing it from a point in time does give Millbrook and the Occupational Therapy Service the opportunity to engage with customers at an earlier point. What they'll be looking at doing is to maximising the mandatory grant to see how that can best meet people's needs. Because there's been the availability of a discretionary top-up funding that has been utilised, and there probably have been opportunities to utilise the mandatory grant in other ways to still meet individuals' needs. Where those can't be met through the mandatory grant, there are alternative funding streams. So that can be through the landlord, particularly if it's a social landlord, third sector organisations, as well as looking at alternative housing options. So if the property is fundamentally unsuitable, is there an alternative that could meet their needs? So I've mentioned around wider sort of discretionary grants. So the intention is to retain the other discretionary grants that we allocate. But what we recognise is that we haven't previously had a cap on those figures because I suppose the budget hasn't been as tight as it has now become. But we recognise that if we were to stop those grants, it would probably lead to people requiring a mandatory grant or a larger adaptation because they're very much preventative in their nature. So we intend to continue with the wider discretionary grants, but we've set caps against each of those, which are in table 3 of the report. I mentioned earlier, so ultimately this will need to lead to an update to the Council's housing assistance policy, so we'll be bringing that back before this committee in due course.
Thank you, Tom. Can I open that to the floor then, please? Got Councillor Lawrenson, Councillor Mace, Councillor Ali, Councillor Millmore.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the report. Yeah, it's a pretty grim situation, of course, because what we're saying is essentially that because of the amount we've already pledged, which is 60 grand beyond what we would have in the fund, we're not going to help people as much as we have been helping. And some of the most vulnerable people in Worcester. So 2 points. I'm sceptical that people who are encouraged to find alternative sources of funding because we're taking the discretionary fund away will actually get that money. I'm very sceptical about that. The admin and the effort involved in trying to get a landlord to pay the difference, I believe it when I see it. And the second point is, can we do what we've said we will do as a council with the homelessness prevention grant? Can we apply that same attitude towards lobbying for the Better Care Fund to be better funded, to prevent uncertainty for some very vulnerable people? Because without that discretionary fund, that top-up, which clearly has been allocated because there's a need for it, aren't we at risk of doing sort of half measures, where people get a little bit of the money for some of the adaptations they need in their own home, but it's not enough to give them the peace of mind that they want truly? What's the point in doing a half measure? So there's a strong argument that we should sustain the discretionary top-up, but of course that money's not going to come from the sky. We need to get it from somewhere. Well, as the Better Care Fund is a government allocation, surely we should go back to the government and say this money is needed. Can you give, let's see what happens in 5-6 weeks with the general election. Can we have that money and provide assurance for 2004, 2005, 2005, 2006? Because otherwise people are going to have half measures and not the adaptations that they really need.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lawrence, and I'll let Tom come back on that. I think it is worth pointing out again that this wasn't ever new money. It was already money that we had underspent, that we'd, as a committee, 4 years ago, decided that actually we had the luxury of being able to offer an extra discretionary fund. I think the need now is such that that's increased the mandatory requirements, hence the decision that we're taking now. But I absolutely get your point in terms of those that aren't going to be able to meet the threshold for a full need.
Yeah, I mean, clearly this isn't the position that we would want to be in, and I wouldn't want to be bringing this recommendation to the committee tonight. I think it's the perfect storm in many respects, that the allocation that's granted around the Better Care Fund for disabled visitor grants, obviously part of that calculation involves the £30,000 mandatory allocation. As I say, that hasn't changed. I haven't got the figure, the date that it was set, but it's been the same for 5, 8, 10 years. So obviously what you could have got for £30,000 5 years ago is nothing like what you could get now. So one of the asks for us, I guess, is around recognising that £30,000 threshold doesn't necessarily deliver what it once did. So what we do now see is more people now requiring more than that £30,000. So whereas that wasn't so much of an issue previously, we now see more people that require that additional amount because costs have gone up.
So Tom, the question here is it within our gift to change that 30,000 limit, or is that central government? Yeah.
Yeah, set by central government. So that's national.
So that's something that we need to obviously lobby to change for. Councillor Mace?
Thank you. I just want to agree with everything Neil said at the start. I think I find myself struggling a great deal to be able to support the recommendations here, partly because one of them is it's called a temporary suspension of the grant, but one of the meanings of temporary is that it's time limited and there's no limit given to when we would look at this again. And I think it's extremely unfortunate that the people who are going to have the most complex needs and the biggest requirements are going to find out now that we might not be able to help them, and especially it's an extremely unfortunate situation that with Millbrook now doing better at delivering the modifications needed to get people to live independently in their own homes, and occupational health doing their assessments quicker, that we're now in a situation where all that work that they've done to improve things are not going to matter because we won't be able to fulfill all the needs that everyone has. So it's extremely unfortunate this is going to fall on those who have those most complex needs. One of the things I regularly get asked on the doorstep is, what can you do about the hospital? And I always feel that I have to be honest with people and say, well, as a local councillor, we can lobby for improvements to the hospital, and but it's not in our gift to make significant changes. And one of the grants we're looking at here is the grant for helping people make modifications when they have hospital discharge. If those grants are not available because we've hit the cap or the funding's not available, that's going to be affecting the hospital and have knock-on changes. So we will see knock-on changes, across the city as a result of this. So I think without knowing when we're going to look at it again, I would struggle to support it.
Chair, the report sets out that we intend to bring a review of the housing assistance policy back in March. So at that point, we will provide a comprehensive report on what the review has found. So the way I am seeing this is that the suspension will be in place until that time the report is brought, and the members get to debate that again in a different meeting.
There's your answer, Councillor Mace. Councillor Ali?
Thank you, Chair. My question has already been asked by Councillor Neil. We can't really, it's not in our gift to change it or set the limit. I think my suggestion would be to you, Chair, if we pass kind of motion or to give a strong message through this community committee that 30k is not enough. That was set 5 years ago. Things have changed. Cost of living, the building cost has changed. So 30k is not something suitable for the residents. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Ali. I'm sure we can take that and feed that back, can't we? And absolutely it isn't. It's, we're not going to get the same amount of value as we did 5 years ago as we are now with that, which will affect obviously what we deliver. Councillor Wilmore?
This item breaks my heart. Outside of my councillor life, I'm a physiotherapist, and I lead a team of physiotherapists and occupational therapists. And I see the implication that this type of thing has on people's lives. This is often children who have profound needs who are growing to adulthood, who need extra provision, people who have had life-changing events or injuries, stroke, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, amputations. And I'm so upset that when these people need the support, that we as a society are just not able to give it to them. It's a double hit. It's people who have been you know, subject to often, you know, kind of, again, horrendous life-changing events, and who also are the people who are in the position who are least financially able to, you know, kind of make the accommodations that they need from their own purse. So, you know, I know the situation that we're in. You know, in a way we have to recommend it because we don't really have a choice. So I'll recommend it with such a heavy heart. And I just really hope that by the time the report comes back in March, that we will have a glimmer of hope, that things will change and we can support, you know, these people in Worcester just that little bit better, because it is what they deserve.
Well, Councillor Wilmore, I think that sums up the exact sentiment each and everyone is feeling around the table here in terms of that. It is heartbreaking that we have to make this decision, but the sad reality is that this is what is in our control, and this is the only option that we have left with the current financial situation that we face ourselves with, and with no further money coming from county or central government in terms of that. So it's our job, each and every one of us, to lobby our representatives and to get that changed. Are there any other speakers on this item? No. Can I take forward the recommendations then, 1.1 to 1.3 on block? Can I ask for all those in favour of this recommendation? Okay. Can I ask all those who are against? That's noted. And all those who are abstaining. Thank you, Julian. Is that noted? Thank you. That concludes the business for this evening. Thank you very much for your participation in this, and hope you have a safe evening. Thank you.